Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video. Wishing you all good health and peace. The dawn crept over the village like a thief, its light stealing through the mist that cloaked the hills, but Diep felt no gentleness in its touch. She stood in the doorway of an old house, her hands gripping a bamboo basket, its weave frayed like her nerves. The air was heavy with the scent of dew and wood smoke, woven with the distant clatter of the market waking beyond the fields. Hockey, her little dog, curled at her feet, his eyes bright with trust, but even his warmth couldn't ease the knot in her chest. Hours ago, she'd held $20,000 in her hands, a fortune offered by James's father with a single demand: "Leave my son." She'd taken it, her voice barely a whisper, and now the weight of that choice pressed against her heart, a stone she couldn't shift. She set the basket down, its creak a quiet lament, and gazed at the unfamiliar yard, its dirt packed hard by lives she didn't know. The village stirred, its rhythm a faint pulse, roosters crowing, a child's laughter fading into the morning. But this wasn't her place, not the shack where she'd cooked rice with salt, where she'd sat with James under the tamarind tree, dreaming of a life that seemed possible. She thought of the stream near her old home, its waters glinting like scattered coins, where James had held her hand and spoken of forever. "These fields, Diep," he'd said, his voice steady as the earth, "they're ours. We'll build something here." She'd believed him, her heart wide as the sky, thinking love could root deeper than the rice they planted. But now those dreams were ash, scattered by her own hands, by a choice she'd made to save not him, but the family she'd only just found. Diep knelt by Hockey, her fingers tracing his fur, and whispered, "You're still here, aren't you? Even when I've lost everything." His tail wagged, a small defiance against her grief, and she clung to it, a flicker of light in the dark. She thought of her mother, found after 20 years, her face lined with sickness and joy, her arms trembling as they held her. "My child," she'd said, her voice breaking, and Diep had wept, the years of being sold, of being lost, melting in that embrace. They'd sat together yesterday, weaving bamboo baskets, the air thick with the scent of rice and memory. Her mother had smiled, frail but fierce, and taught her to balance the weave, her hands steady despite the cancer that gnawed at her. "You're home now," she'd said, and Diep had wanted to believe it, wanted to hold that moment forever. But home was fragile, built on borrowed time. Her brother Tuan had stood beside them, his eyes shadowed with debt and fear. He'd brought her here, to this old house, after she'd fled from James, hoping to shield her from his world. "He's busy," Tuan had said, his voice low. "Projects, exports, TET bonuses. Don't burden him." She'd nodded, thinking she could protect James, keep his dreams, cassava flour, clean farms, a better life for farmers, from crumbling under her weight. But then their mother's cough had deepened, and Tuan's creditors had come, their voices sharp, demanding money he didn't have. 2 months' interest, they'd said, and Tuan had faltered, his hands empty, his hope sold with the last of his buffalo. Her mother's face rose in her mind, clear as the morning light, her eyes crinkled with warmth, her voice soft as she spoke of the past. They'd eaten together last night, rice and pork, Hockey at their feet, and Diep had laughed, the sound foreign in her throat. "You cook well, Tuan," she'd said, and he'd smiled, but his eyes had stayed distant, heavy with secrets. She hadn't known then that he'd been offered a way out, a deal from James's father. Convince her to take the money, to leave James, and save their mother's life. "She's your sister," the man had said, his voice cold, revealing a truth Tuan had only suspected. Diep had felt it too, a familiarity in his face, confirmed by the mark on her neck, by their mother's tears. But that truth had come with a price, a choice that tore at them both. Yesterday had begun with joy, fragile but fierce. She'd woken to find Tuan at the door, his face taut with worry, and their mother beside him, her hands trembling but alive. "We've found you," she'd said, and Diep had clung to her, the years of loss falling away. They'd sat in the yard, weaving baskets, talking of the past, her uncle's betrayal, the family that had bought her, the escape that had brought her to James. "You're strong," her mother had said, and Diep had wanted to believe it, wanted to be the daughter who could carry them all. But then Tuan had confessed, his voice breaking, about the debt, the hospital bills, the men who wouldn't wait. "They want it now," he'd said, and she'd seen the fear in his eyes, the kind that mirrored her own. She'd gone to the market that morning, buying meat and greens, her coins few but enough to cook for them. The stalls had been alive with Tet's approach, voices haggling over chickens and rice, the air thick with anticipation. An old man, his face etched like tree bark, had paused by her side. "You're new," he'd said, his voice kind, and she'd nodded, her throat tight. He'd pressed a guava into her hand, its skin warm. "For luck," he'd said, and walked on, leaving her with tears she couldn't shed. She'd returned to the house, cooked with Tuan, watched their mother eat, and thought maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild. But then the call had come, James's father summoning her to the farm, his voice a command she couldn't ignore. She'd stood among the melon vines, the air heavy with dust, and faced him, his eyes cold as stone. $20,000, he'd said, holding out the money. "Take it and leave my son." She'd hesitated, her heart pounding, thinking of James, of his laughter, his plans, his belief in her. But then she'd seen her mother's face, Tuan's despair, the hospital bills piling like stones on their backs. "Is it too late?" she'd asked, her voice small, and he'd nodded, the bills crisp in his hand. She'd taken them, her fingers trembling, and walked away, the weight of that choice heavier than any harvest. She'd told herself it was for them, for her mother's life, for Tuan's freedom, but the lie burned, a wound that bled with every step. Diep wandered to the stream now, its waters glinting under the noon sun, a ribbon of light against the earth. Haki trotted beside her, his warmth a fleeting balm. She let her fingers trail in the current, its chill grounding her thoughts. Her past was a shadow, sold and reclaimed, but her love for James was a fire, burning despite the money in her hands. She'd met him by chance, mistaking him for a policeman, and he'd laughed, his eyes kind, drawing her in before she knew his wealth. "You're enough," he'd told her, and she'd believed him, her heart growing like the crops they tended. They'd worked the fields together, harvesting pumpkins, planning a future where love outweighed money. But now she'd chosen otherwise, or so it seemed, and the not knowing, what he'd think, what he'd do, was a wound deeper than her own. She thought of her grandmother, gone these many years, who'd sat with her under the stars, telling stories of bamboo flutes carved from rice stalks, blown to call the rain when drought scorched the land. "The gods listen," she'd said, her eyes crinkling with faith, and as a child, Diep had believed it, blowing tunes until her breath ran dry. They'd lain on a mat by the river, fireflies dancing, and her grandmother had named the stars for dreamers who defied the odds. "You're one of them," she'd whispered, and Diep had carried that whisper through the years, a spark against the dark. Now it flickered, threatened by her choice, by the money that lay hidden in her bag, a secret she couldn't share. Her past rose unbidden, a chain she'd broken but never forgotten. Sold by her uncle, married to a stranger she'd escaped, building a life from scraps. A shack, a garden, a love she thought was hers. James had seen her, not as poor or broken, but as whole, and she'd dared to dream with him, to plant more than crops, to grow a future. But Tuan's debt, her mother's sickness, had pulled her back, and James's father had known it, wielding their pain like a weapon. "Take it," he'd said, and she had, thinking it would save them. But as she sat by the stream, Haki at her side, she wondered if she'd saved anything at all, or if she'd traded one loss for another. She thought of James somewhere beyond the hills, his hands stained with work, his heart searching for her. He'd stood in his office yesterday, papers strewn with numbers, 4 billion in profit, 200 million for workers' families, 20 tons of wood to export before Tet. "You're doing well," his chairman had said, but James had barely listened, his mind on her. "Where's Diep?" he'd asked Tuan, his voice sharp, and Tuan had lied, his eyes averted, hiding her to protect her or himself. James hadn't known then that his father had acted, that the money had changed hands, that she'd walked away. Would he search for her, crossing villages and fields, or would he believe she'd betrayed him as his father hoped? She didn't know, and the not knowing was a wound that bled with every breath. The village carried on, its people woven into her days. She thought of the market, its stalls alive with Tet's hum, where she'd bought meat and laughed with Tuan, pretending life was simple. She thought of her mother, her hands weaving baskets, her voice soft with love. "You're home," she'd said, and Diep had wanted to stay, to cook for her, to hold her through the night. But Tuan's creditors had come, their demands a shadow over their meal, and she'd seen the fear in his eyes, the kind that mirrored her own. He'd sold everything, buffalo, chickens, ducks, to keep their mother alive, and now she'd taken the money, hoping it would be enough. But would it save her? Or would it only deepen their debt, tying them to a man who saw her as nothing? Dusk settled, painting the hills in shades of gold and shadow. Diepp returned to the house, hockey at her heels, the guava warm in her palm. The air carried the scent of rice and dew, wrapping her in a fleeting peace. The kitchen was bare, its walls weathered, but she lit a candle, its flame dancing like a memory. She sliced the guava, its juice sweet against her fingers, and fed a piece to Hockey, his eyes bright with trust. She thought of her mother's stories, of women who'd loved against the odds, who'd faced scorn and stood tall. The heart knows its own path, her mother had said, and Diepp wanted to believe it, wanted to trust that her love for James could endure. But the money lay heavy, a choice she couldn't undo. She pictured James searching for her, his voice calling, "Diepp, where are you?" His faith shaken by her absence. His father had won, or so it seemed, turning her love into a transaction, her loyalty into doubt. Would James find her, crossing the world to reclaim her, or would he turn away, believing she'd chosen money over him? She thought of Tuan, his hands empty, his heart torn between her and their mother. Would he forgive her, or would the money drive them apart? A debt they couldn't repay? She didn't know, and the not knowing was a wound deeper than her own. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the creak of the house's walls and Hockey's soft whines. In her dreams she saw James's father, his eyes cold, holding out the money like a chain. She reached for James, but he was gone, leaving only the sound of water rushing over stones, endless and cold. She woke to dawn's first light, her body weary but her resolve flickering, a small flame that refused to die. She rose, fed Hockey, and stepped outside, the village stirring under a sky heavy with clouds. The path stretched ahead, unfamiliar but steady, winding through hills that held both her past and her future. She thought of James, of his vow to find her, of the love they'd built in fields and shacks. Would he cross the world for her, or would her choice, the money, the silence, break him as his father hoped? She thought of her mother, her brother, the family she'd found, and the price she'd paid to save them. Today she'd weave baskets, cook rice, and carry on, her heart a quiet drumbeat against the morning's song. But in that heart a question lingered, soft as moonlight, sharp as stone. Was their love over, crushed by the weight of her choice, or could it survive, a spark waiting to flare? And James, what would he do, faced with her absence, his father's truth? The answers weren't here, not yet. They lay somewhere beyond the fields, beyond the hills, in a moment she couldn't yet see. For now Diepp walked on, her steps steady, her soul a flickering flame that burned against the dawn.